Well, folks, thanks for joining us again today and joining the increasing number of people in Canada and the U.S. who are tuning into Stock All Day, day-to-day news, because we give you insights behind the headlines on the main stories that we're seeing today. And look, we're going to cover some pretty wild stuff that's been happening just over the last 12 hours. Canada, what's happening in Canada relative to possibly going to an election, and even a bigger story than that, which didn't even get covered in Canada other than way down in the headlines, is what just happened in China with the US and with Trump and talk of nuclear testing and new nukes under the water. We're going to look at that. We're going to look at a comparison between what's going on in New York City, as they look like they're going to be electing a communist mayor, as he's been called, to some pretty staggering and worrisome things that are going on in Sudan right now. So let's get right into it. Just hours ago, we saw a resolution of what was really shaping up to be one of the large stories in terms of conflict, certainly in the last few years, and that's China and the U.S. going head-to-head. And China, right up until yesterday, threatening to cut off and shut down all the rare earth minerals that ship into the U.S., which are so needed for the computer industry, for the defense industry, and science and technology. And you saw huge tariffs coming at China from the U.S., and underlying all of that, you hear discussions about renewed nuclear testing. What actually happened just hours ago was that China and the U.S. came to an agreement. President Trump and President Xi over there in Asia made a decision. And so the U.S. decided they would drop, and they told China, we're going to drop by 10%, or drop from 57% to 47%, a whole list of tariffs that have been hitting China from the U.S. And in exchange for that, China said, okay, we will keep allowing the shipment of rare earth minerals to the U.S. at least for another year. China also said they will drop some of the agriculture wars that they were doing, and that's by not buying U.S. soybean and other products. They said they're going to change that. So some pretty dramatic changes that came about, and almost overnight, and you see the difference in the markets. Yesterday, as you recall, when I reported to you, we see markets in turmoil, and today we see some positive response. So amazing stuff going on there. Very interesting. If you were in Canada today, and even as the story broke, I broke this story, among others, of course, at early in the hours of 1 a.m., 2 a.m. And if you go on as of this morning, you look at our national subsidized media outlets, the CBC and others, that story about what was averted with the China-U.S. talks, way down in the list, way down below other stories. It's almost as if anything Trump does, then our national subsidized media doesn't want to talk about it, doesn't want to report it. That's just a fascinating little sideline. One thing that won't be a sideline in Canada is the fact that we could, in Canada, be going to an election in a matter of days. There's a real standoff that's beginning to emerge because the federal government is coming out with their budget, a budget that they have not produced a budget in a record period of time has passed 18 months since there was a first, final, and formal budget from the new government. That's unheard of in Canadian history. And this budget is loaded with debt and deficit and spending. And the question is going to be, have the federal Liberals got the message? Or are they going to continue to try and win this next election just by literally buying off huge constituencies and thousands and millions of votes? Or are they going to get serious? What's going to happen is an election could well be forced if they don't get support from enough of the opposition parties in Canada. So keep an eye on that emerging. And right along with that election, another election, when you look at it in the States, that's coming up in New York City, where Zoran Mandami, who is being seen and portrayed with some credibility as being probably the most leftist, ultra-leftist politician at this level in the U.S., and everything is being talked about. The people who are running against him and former Mayor Cuomo and others who are very concerned that Mondami is talking about actually implementing for real the socialist policies of totally taking over, controlling distribution of products and services, the making of products and services, really sweeping, significantly left-leaning socialist changes. And now all kinds of things are coming out about him. His father, of course, he comes from a very wealthy and well-to-do family. There's things coming out that he's just recently said about the biggest gripe that he had about the Twin Towers and 9/11 and the killing of 3,000 people on that fateful day by, let's just call it Islamist forces. And he's being seen as an Islamist, and there's a difference there when we talk about Islamist vis-a-vis Muslims. So an Islamist being the radical end of Islam, which talks about the need for violence and the need for total domination. And recent tapes of his father, who is a professor, teaching a course in the U.S., saying that Abraham Lincoln was the motivating force for Adolf Hitler to look at exterminating the genocide of the Jews. Just all kinds of wild stuff is flying around. But one of the things that's holding him up is his greatest support is coming from the 18 to 34-year-old crowd, those who have most recently, over the last 2 decades, been exposed to the depths of multiculturalism and the real extent of teaching of what we call cultural Marxism in the public schools 1 to 12, and also in universities. The vast teaching of this has had a real effect on the thinking of that entire cohort of the population. So it's really just shaping up to be an interesting situation. The projection of people that will leave and business that will leave. You know, in every election, there's always people who say, well, if this person gets elected to that party, I'll leave the country. In New York City, it could be by the hundreds of thousands of people, if not the millions. So that is all shaping up at the same time as Canada is actually looking at the possibility of an election. And it's going to be based really on some of the same, very same things that are being discussed in the New York election. So it's kind of a framework as you look across the border, kind of a mirror image on the same battles. Are enough people concerned and believing that if a government keeps spending and if a government does not get things under control and taxes keep going up, that we actually will see a collapse of economy, whether it's a urban economy like New York City or whether it's an entire national economy in Canada. So people are watching to see how these particular elections may roll out. Going international, on things, a bit of this theme of things that don't get reported in the news, just as in much of Canadian media. The meetings between Trump and Xi were largely unreported or reported way down the list. They talk about the very concerning topic of genocide, comes up so much, especially related to Israel and what happened in the war on Gaza. And now that a ceasefire is it's shaking, it's a little wobbly, but it does still seem to be in place. And now that UN forces and media, even left-leaning media, have gone into Gaza and has seen that, yes, of course, there was death and destruction. There was no genocide, that many of the stories of kids being killed, in fact, were not true, though, of course, people did die, including children on both sides. So now that's been established that, in fact, after 2 years of people saying, not just in the news, but around the world in all of these demonstrations that took place, the real genocide, one of the real genocides that has been taking place is in Sudan, of a horrific nature. It's estimated now, even by the United Nations, that some 25 million people are facing starvation. So all the focus and frankly the lies about food and supplies not going into Gaza, when in fact food and supplies were going in. And the headlines daily around the news were genocide and starvation in Gaza, none of which now we find did happen. But truly in Sudan, 25 million people facing starvation. They feel that over the extent of the war, the internal civil war that's been going on there, 500,000 children killed. And now we know, and we have proof, child soldiers being trained and equipped by the Islamic side in terms of just murdering people in cold blood. But in a sweeping way, we're talking about thousands of people, and this getting almost zero coverage in international media. Certainly if you look at Canadian media, very little coverage. And US media, there is some. The journalists are seem to be a little more focused on talking about reality. And so we ask ourselves, why is this? And one of the answers, or one of the suggestions, is that because the mass murdering and the extent of the genocide is being perpetrated by the Islamist side. Now, again, I make a distinction. We're not talking about Muslims around the world, the majority of which would like to live in peace, but we're talking about millions upon millions of Islamists who see their religion as a force for violence and a force for complete domination. And in spite of that, it seems to be that mainstream media has a fear of criticizing anything that might be negative related to the Islamist, jihadist destruction that goes on. It's a very strange thing. Media is never shy about reporting the failings or the extremes of other religions, but when it comes to Islam, mainstream media, in fact, seem to have some kind of Islamophobia, fear of Islamists. We were really encouraging that people who are speaking up, people who are in the media, whether it's broadcasts like this or others, we've got to bring pressure to bear on the world. And the United Nations has totally failed when it comes to true genocide, what's going on in Sudan. United Nations doing nothing, but the United Nations always quick to bringing up resolutions that condemn Israel for this or that, but almost nothing on Sudan. We need to be making our voices heard on that. What's happening with children in Sudan is nothing but horrific. What's happening to kids in what we might call the modern world, in Canada, US, and Europe, there's been huge concern about the number by the hundreds of thousands of young people under 18 who, in using the apps like AI generated and ChatGPT and others, where they're able to pick the characters that they want to talk to and the voices. These are all artificial, intelligence, and it's been reported. Sometimes you see extreme cases where kids have actually committed suicide through talking to their AI-generated character, and young people who are isolated. This is by the thousands, as we see it now in North America, forming relationships with artificially created intelligence characters. And it's become a real factor of not just creating anxiety at levels we've never seen before in that generation, but extremely destructive behaviors. And so governments have now agreed, in working with some of the largest generators of AI, we're seeing around, at least in the democratic world, the fact that if you're under 18 now, this will be by the end of November, you won't be able to have access to these AI-generated characters that are captivating the hearts and minds of hundreds of thousands of young people. You're going to have to put in an age disclaimer before you go online and access these. The problem is that's going to be very easy to get around, and the large AI companies are mainly doing this to avoid lawsuits. They can say that when some young person, if they wind up committing suicide because they say the AI-generated character encourage them to do that. If that's the accusation, companies have to protect themselves from lawsuits. So that's why they're putting in these elements, of when you go to sign on, you have to say you're a certain age. Really, that part of the security process is a joke. Anybody will, a 6-year-old will be able to quite easily get around that particular barrier. So the question is still going to remain. Sure, the AI companies will put in these so-called protective walls, but all you have to do, apparently, is to click on there and say that you're over 18. The bigger question is, what are we going to do about the problem? The problem is not going to go away. The problem of social isolation, the problem of anxiety levels across an entire generation that we've simply never seen before, the problem of literally overtaking minds and hearts of people by artificially generated characters, this is still going to be an issue. Folks, it's going to have to be addressed. We're going to have to give thought to that. Other areas of anxiety that we've been reporting on recently, and you've been seeing in mainstream media, is the percentage of people apparently anxious about the world ending because of environmental collapse. And extensive polling that's being done, and myself on this podcast and other people, of course, around the world have been saying that yes, of course there are environmental concerns. Yes, of course we should be concerned about emissions. But the fact is, it's not as extreme. At least some of us have been saying this, and an increasing number of scientists have been saying this, that it is not the end of the world. And as we reported first, you heard it first here on day-to-day news, that people who were seen as major, let's say, movers in that particular discussion, people like Bill Gates, now are saying, you know what, sure, it's an issue and it's something we have to address. It is not the existential threat to civilization that we thought it was. Climate change is not advancing and crushing over us the way we thought it would. So when you have people at that level, the Bill Gates of the world saying that, it actually corresponds to what we are finding. Very extensive polling just released over the last couple days. And you might find this shocking, but the number of people now, the percentage of people in the population who say that the top risk to the world is the environmental situation and climate issues, 2% now. Only 2% of people actually believe that. That number is so low because as more and more evidence comes out, in fact, we are not facing the end of the world through cataclysmic environmental disaster, and that's becoming more known. People are becoming more aware of that. The highest group that has concerned and is anxious about it is the 18 to 34-year-old crowd. They are the most concerned, and the generation under them, they are the most concerned. Even at their levels, it is not seeming to tip the balance. So environmental concerns, yes. Is it the top issue facing civilization? 2% think it is. The rest don't. Just something to keep in mind. Let's look for ways to always see an improved environment, but let's realize we don't have to introduce drastic Orwellian measures which cripple economies, which keep people in poverty, and in fact, which do not help the environment. Let's keep those things in mind. And as we look at the world that's influenced by media, and now we're talking about the world of entertainment, in Hollywood, we're continuing to see the economic effects of lack of support coming in for the major Hollywood, some of the major Hollywood theaters, major Hollywood production theaters, major Hollywood production companies. We're talking like companies like Paramount, which has just announced they're laying off 2,000 workers. All of the companies, everything related to the movies and the messages that come out of Hollywood itself, are in severe retreat because of economic pressures, less and less people wanting to buy their product. And it's being suggested the two reasons for that. The people are tired of the so-called woke messages that companies like Paramount and Disney continue to try to weave through their movies, whether it's animated cartoons like Snow White or whether it's major productions. People are getting more and more fed up with the woke messages that are being pressed and impressed upon them. And then there's the other factor, going back to AI, with so much AI generation now, so much in movies, including many of the action scenes now and others being generated by artificial intelligence, not really happening. Audiences are becoming increasingly aware of this, and they're not that excited about it. However, just on the culture side, the one part of the industry and entertainment industry that seems to be moving ahead, and we use as an example Angel Studios. So these are some, not all, some of the faith-based production companies, movie companies, and television companies seem to be doing better. Of course, in 2023, Angel Studios had their breakout success with their movie Sound of Freedom. And just recently now in September, Angel Studios, with a number of their faith-based productions, has been able to go into the public market. And we've seen that they're with a sale into the marketplace, with people being able to buy on the stock market and buy into Angel Studios, a placement of $1.6 billion in terms of market capitalization as recently as September. So on the faith side, some of these companies seem to be going up, and the ones going out are the ones that traditionally challenge things like faith. Let's see what kind of faith we have going forward. Thanks for tuning in today. Stay with us. See you again tomorrow.